What's up, guys? In Oakland, Cassius is at a job interview for a telemarketing operator position at Regale View. He even brought a high school trophy and an Employee of the Month plaque with him. However, the manager Anderson notices that all the experience on his resume is fake. One of the phone numbers belongs to Cassius's friend Salvador, who applied for the same position and forgot to change his voicemail greeting. And Anderson used to work at the other company listed. So he knows Cassius was never employed there. Cassius has no choice but to admit he made both the plaque and the trophy himself. But Anderson doesn't care. He'll hire anyone who shows initiative. So Cassius now has a commission-only job. The next morning, he wakes up feeling philosophical. He asks his girlfriend Detroit if she's ever thought about growing old and dying, because he's worried about living his life without ever doing anything meaningful. She explains that small moments matter too, because not everything has to be about legacy. They start kissing, but are interrupted when the door opens and the neighbors see what they're doing. It turns out Cassius has been living in his uncle's garage. Then he turns on the TV and watches a commercial for Worry-Free. The company calls itself a new lifestyle model because workers live inside the factory, meaning they get beds and food. They sell it as the perfect arrangement, but it looks more like a prison, especially since the contracts are lifelong. On the way to work, Cassius is stopped by his uncle Sergio, who reminds him that he owes 4 months of rent. Sergio is drowning in debt, so he gives him 2 weeks to pay. Cassius complains that his uncle isn't being kind to his own family. Then Sergio reminds him he gave him a car that barely works. When Cassius arrives at the office, he notices a very fancy elevator in the back and stares at the boss, Mr. Blip, whose name gets censored every time it's mentioned. Manager Johnny takes him to his desk and explains that a light will turn on whenever he makes a sale. If he works hard enough, he could become a power caller upstairs and make real money. Then he makes his first call. He imagines himself appearing inside the home of a couple having breakfast, but the man hangs up the second Cassius says hello. The second call is answered by a woman busy with someone else, and she hangs up too. The elderly lady on the third call actually listens, but she explains she has no money because her husband is in the hospital with cancer. Cassius doesn't know what to do, and notices the sign reminding him to follow the script, which says he should turn every problem into a sales opportunity. So he tells her the encyclopedia he's selling includes tips on staying healthy, causing her to hang up immediately. The next day, Cassius keeps failing to make any sales. His coworker Langston tells him to use his white voice. Cassius gets confused and says people already tell him he sounds white sometimes. But Langston explains that's only like a white Will Smith, which just means polite. The real white voice has no worries. It already paid its bills and feels secure about the future. Langston clarifies that white people don't actually sound like that. Then he changes his voice to demonstrate the trick, and Cassius is shocked. It's almost like Langston is being dubbed. Sometime later, the employees attend a meeting to meet the new team leader, Diana. She and Johnny keep trying to use corporate jargon to motivate everyone, saying they should think of the team as a family. Their metaphors completely fail. Then Cassius asks whether working harder means they'll get paid more, but his question is ignored. Afterward, he tries getting coffee from the machine, but nothing comes out. His coworker Squeeze explains that management even makes them pay for snacks. He's impressed by Cassius speaking up during the meeting and reveals he's trying to convince the staff to fight for better pay. They can't talk there, so Squeeze invites Cassius to a bar and promises he'll pay. That night, Detroit is finishing her shift as a sign spinner on the street. Cassius picks her up and introduces her to Squeeze, explaining that she's an incredible artist. Detroit tries complimenting Cassius too by mentioning the great things he accomplished in high school, but he cuts her off. He asks her not to talk about high school because that's in the past. As adults, they shouldn't be stuck obsessing over dumb teenage achievements. As an example, he points at former football players from school who now work at the furniture store and play football all day. Cassius thinks they're stagnant, but Salvador believes they're just friends having fun together. At the bar, the group watches the news and discovers police fought against protesters calling Worry-Free's lifetime contracts a new form of slavery. Worry-Free CEO Steve says in an interview that it doesn't count as slavery because workers don't sign the contracts under threat of physical violence. The protests were organized by a group known as the Left Eye Faction, whose members wear a black mark beneath their left eye. An activist explains that normal jobs barely exist anymore because Worry-Free is replacing everything, even sweatshops. Their facilities are basically prisons where employees work 14-hour shifts and are fed brainwashing propaganda. Cassius and his friends spend the night talking, drinking, and having fun. When it's time for a toast, he reveals he perfected his white voice, shocking everyone. Then they start talking about work. Squeeze says the promise of becoming a power caller is a lie managers tell employees so they won't quit. He pulls out pamphlets and says they need to form a union so they can finally get paid properly. The next morning, Cassius tells Sergio he gets paid on Friday, so he'll cover all the rent he owes. However, Sergio no longer cares. Even Cassius's money won't be enough to solve his debt. The bank will repossess the house soon, so he needs to start looking for somewhere else to live. Sergio is so desperate that he's starting to consider working for Worry-Free himself. Back at the office, Cassius finally starts connecting with customers thanks to his white voice. Johnny becomes extremely impressed and walks over to celebrate every time Cassius closes a sale. He also says the bosses are talking about his success, meaning he could become a power caller very soon. Detroit is also working part-time at Regal View. The next time they go to the bar, Squeeze shows Cassius the newspaper. Unfortunately, the Senate committee cleared Worry-Free of all slavery accusations. The TV at the bar is playing a show called I Got the Syrup Kicked Out of Me, where contestants get beaten and humiliated on camera for entertainment. Squeeze thinks it's depressing that this is now the most popular show in the country, attracting 150 million viewers every night. The next morning, Squeeze organizes the team for their first protest action. When he says phones down, everybody will stop working for 20 minutes. He asks if anyone wants to back out now, and Cassius hesitates for a moment before showing support. On his way to his desk, Cassius can't stop staring at the special elevator, something Mr. Blip notices. That afternoon, Squeezy shouts, "Phones down," and everyone starts chanting insults against the company. Cassius hesitates at first, but eventually joins in, clapping and shouting along, feeling like he's finally doing something meaningful. Sometime later, he gets called into the manager's office. When they tell him to grab his things and leave, he immediately starts insulting them, refusing to stop fighting for a good cause. However, the managers explain that he needs to move his belongings to the first floor because he's been promoted to power caller. Johnny notices Squeeze and Salvador staring through the window, so he closes the blinds. Cassius feels conflicted and imagines the football players from high school inside the office as a sign that he's becoming stagnant too. However, once the managers tell him how much money he'll make and pop open a bottle of champagne, he celebrates and drinks with them. The next day, Cassius arrives at work wearing the only suit he owns. Diana takes him to the fancy elevator, where she has to type an absurdly long password to make it work. The elevator's voice welcomes Cassius and compliments him with weird and flirtatious comments. On the first floor, he finally meets Mr. Blip, who also uses a white voice and says everyone must speak that way there. He explains that they sell power in two forms, firepower and labor. Cassius is horrified when he realizes he'll be selling weapons and worry-free labor, which is basically slavery. Thanks to those lifetime contracts, the workers don't receive salaries, so companies can build cars for the cost of a bicycle. At first, Cassius hesitates, but he quickly starts working once they tell him how much money he'll make. Meanwhile, an activist is vandalizing a worry-free billboard in the street. Soon, a man notices her, and she's forced to run away. Once she gets far enough, she removes her disguise and reveals herself to be Detroit, proving she's part of the Left Eye movement. After that, she heads to work and is visited by Squeeze, who also knows some impressive sign-spinning tricks. He learned them in Los Angeles, where he helps sign spinners unionize too. Detroit shares that she uses her art to help the revolution. Then Squeeze asks about her relationship with Cassius, because he doesn't seem nearly as radical as she is. She insists everything is fine, but her answer sounds strange. Then Squeeze notices a small mark on her cheek left by the left eye symbol and offers her a ride home, but she says Cassius will pick her up. Hours pass, and Cassius is still trapped in the office because he has to learn the new rules, products, and scripts. Detroit gets tired of waiting and has to call a friend for a ride. When Cassius finally leaves work, he goes to the gallery and apologizes to her, explaining that he was promoted to power caller and only waited to tell her because he wasn't sure it was real. She asks what he sells now, but he quickly changes the subject to her artwork. While Detroit explains the message behind her pieces, Cassius barely listens. He's so exhausted that he can only stare at her cigarette. Once she finally shares it with him, he feels more awake and can truly hear her again. The next day, Cassius finds Squeeze organizing the workers once more. He tells everyone that he's a power caller now, so he'll support his friends from behind the scenes, mentioning Sergio's debt as the reason. Salvador confronts him for selling out, and an argument begins. Although it's mostly passive-aggressive compliments, Langston has to separate them while Cassius heads inside, ignoring the protest. In his new luxurious office, he makes his first call and speaks to an important Japanese businessman while imagining himself inside the man's bathroom. Using his white voice, Cassius explains that Worry-Free can manufacture products for less money, and the businessman loves the idea of doubling his market share to crush the competition. Moments later, Mr. Blip announces that Cassius made a huge sale on his very first day, and everyone raises a toast. Cassius shares his financial situation and asks if he can get paid immediately. Mr. Blip is so happy with the deal that he agrees. After work, Cassius gives Sergio enough money to pay off his debt. Day after day, Cassius keeps closing massive deals. Soon he has a brand new luxury car and his own apartment filled with expensive furniture and decorations. One morning, Cassius turns on the TV and sees a report about the strike at Regal View. All his friends are protesting outside and refusing to let anyone enter the building. Regal View is tired of it, so they hired a security company to violently shove protesters aside in order to help the power callers get to work. When Detroit wakes up, Cassius accidentally speaks to her using his white voice. She scolds him and he apologizes, claiming he did it without thinking. Detroit believes it's a terrible sign and says she can't keep doing this anymore. He's been crossing the picket line every day and she thinks he's betraying the cause and his friends. An argument breaks out, and they end up fighting over the blankets. After falling out of bed, Cassius admits he wanted a good job so he could seem more interesting to her. However, Detroit explains she already liked the old Cassius, and if he crosses the picket line today, their relationship is over. Outside the building, Cassius and the other power callers are surrounded by guards who begin beating protesters to clear a path. Cassius ends up crossing the picket line anyway. That night, Mr. Blip throws another celebration for him because of all his successful sales. Afterward, Cassius drives past Detroit's gallery but decides not to visit her since they're no longer together. The next day, the guards beat the protesters again to clear the way. Cassius tries to move quickly, but one activist manages to hit him in the head with a soda can. Instead of going home, he puts on a bandage and keeps working. Mr. Blip is so impressed that he invites Cassius to a party hosted by CEO Steve. Cassius promises he'll attend later because he has another event first. That evening, Cassius goes to Detroit's gallery opening and hears her using her own white voice to sell her artwork. He tries complimenting her art, but she can't stand being around the person he's become. Then Salvador calls Cassius a sellout and reveals that the video of him getting hit by the soda can has gone viral. Squeeze tries convincing him to fight for the cause from his new position, since it would make a powerful statement, but he's interrupted when the performance begins. Detroit walks onto the stage wearing nothing but rubber gloves covering her chest and groin. Around her are containers filled with broken phones, used bullet shells, and balloons filled with sheep blood. All of them represent businesses exploiting labor in Africa. She wants the audience to throw the objects at her while she recites quotes from The Last Dragon. During the first few minutes, Detroit speaks peacefully, but soon the crowd starts throwing things at her violently without caring. Cassius loses control and stops them. However, Detroit says he's ruining her show and throws him out. Inside a luxurious mansion, Steve snorts happy powder to kick off the party. Cassius finally gets the chance to meet him and has to use his white voice during their conversation. Steve makes him sit in the middle of the crowd and asks him to tell funny stories from the ghetto. Cassius awkwardly explains that he's never been in a gang. Steve then tells him to drop the white voice and asks him to rap. Cassius says he doesn't know how, but Steve refuses to believe that a black man can't rap and keeps insisting while the crowd starts chanting for him to do it. Giving in to the pressure, Cassius attempts to freestyle, but all his rhymes are terrible, and the crowd quickly gets bored. Desperate to impress them, he suddenly starts shouting the N-word repeatedly with exaggerated energy, causing all the guests to chant along with him. Afterward, the party becomes completely wild, but Cassius refuses to join the pile of naked strangers. Mr. Blip later finds him alone in a room and says Steve wants to see him privately. Cassius follows him into Steve's office and snorts some happy powder from a horse-shaped tray. Steve says he has a huge business proposal and wants Cassius to watch a video explaining everything. However, Steve first needs to use the bathroom. While wandering the hallway, Cassius accidentally enters the wrong door. Inside, he discovers a strange room and hears a voice begging for help from inside a stall. When the voice says it's in terrible pain, Cassius opens the stall and is horrified to see a humanoid horse creature with an enormous member hanging out. The creature begs for mercy, and Cassius backs away, only to bump into more horse creatures hidden behind curtains, all chained up and pleading for help while suffering horribly. Terrified, he runs back into the hallway and crashes into Steve, who's holding a gun. Since Cassius wet himself in fear, Steve escorts him back to the office and starts the video to explain everything. Using stop-motion animation, the film tells the story of how humanity evolved through tools. Humans are constantly inventing better tools, but labor remains limited because of the weaknesses of the human body. That's why Worry-Free created a chemical capable of making people more efficient, durable, stronger, and therefore more profitable. This chemical transforms humans into horse-like creatures called Equisapiens, and it resembles sugar. Hearing this, Cassius completely freaks out because he thinks Steve drugged him with the chemical earlier. However, Steve assures him it was only recreational sugar. He explains they're creating millions of Equisapiens, meaning they'll eventually develop their own society and culture. The company wants to avoid unions or rebellions, so they need one of their own employees living among them to keep everything under control. Steve offers Cassius $100 million if he agrees to become the Equisapien leader for 5 years, promising he'll receive an antidote afterward to become human again. However, Cassius believes this crosses a line that money can't fix, and this time no amount of cash will change his mind. The next morning, Cassius finds an article criticizing Worry-Free. He searches for his cell phone but can't find it anywhere. So he uses his landline to call the newspaper and tells reporters about the horse experiments, but nobody believes a story that insane. When he turns on the TV, he discovers a presenter teaching children how to make a soda can wig representing the viral can incident. Later, at the doctor's office, he hears on the news that the activist who threw the can at him now has a sponsorship deal with the soda company. Cassius asks the doctor if he's turning into a horse while showing him his private parts, causing the doctor to throw him out. Back at his apartment, he asks Detroit the same question, but she says his member looks exactly the same. She also complains because he tried calling her the previous night. Cassius reveals he lost his phone. Detroit explains she received a strange video message from his number, but didn't open it because she assumed it was something sexual. So they watch it together now. It turns out Cassius dropped his phone while escaping from the horse creatures, accidentally starting a video call with Detroit. The recording captured the Equisapiens, scientists injecting them with sedatives, and Steve threatening to turn them into glue. Afterward, Cassius and Detroit become intimate again. Even though Detroit warns him this is only temporary and they can't truly get back together, he swears he's changed and will never become a power caller again. However, that still isn't enough for her. Once Cassius falls asleep, Detroit sneaks out to prepare a new plan with the left eye movement. The next morning, a giant statue appears outside Steve's mansion, depicting a man doing something explicit with a horse. A sign claims Worry-Free is transforming workers into horses, but people assume it's only a metaphor. Meanwhile, Cassius walks through the neighborhood, but people constantly mock him because of the viral video and even throw drinks at him. The humiliation suddenly gives him an idea. The following day, a new soda commercial features the activist kissing an actor pretending to be Cassius. Then, the show I Got the S-Hall Kicked Out of Me begins, and Cassius appears as the newest contestant. He agreed to participate in exchange for them broadcasting his video, but first he must endure several painful and humiliating games. After being beaten and covered in filth, the show finally airs the Equisapien footage. Over the next several days, Cassius appears on serious talk shows warning the public about Worry-Free. Unfortunately, the world is corrupt. Steve is treated like a genius for improving the economy with more efficient labor, causing Worry-Free's stock prices to skyrocket. One afternoon, Cassius meets with Squeeze and Salvador. He apologizes for betraying them and promises to fight alongside them from now on. He also expresses frustration because nobody is taking his warning seriously. That's why they need to stop the power callers from crossing the picket line tomorrow so they can finally achieve a televised victory. When they look out the window, they notice children everywhere wearing soda can wigs for Halloween. Cassius spends the rest of the day planning. He contacts the football players and visits Detroit's sculptures. While analyzing the video, he discovers the password to Steve's lock and sneaks into the mansion. The next day, the protesters wear soda can wigs to reclaim their meaning. The guards start beating them to clear the way, only to end up attacking Detroit's disguised statues. Once the guards are weakened, the football players finish overpowering them, forcing the power callers to retreat. The protesters celebrate their victory, but unfortunately, reinforcements soon arrive. Chaos erupts across the streets as guards beat everyone and even deploy gas. Cassius runs to hide with his friends and calls for his own reinforcements, but at that moment a guard knocks him unconscious. When he wakes up, he's inside the guard's van. Looking through the window, he sees the guards still brutally attacking the protesters. However, the battle suddenly changes when the Equisapiens appear. It turns out Cassius freed them in exchange for their help. Using their enhanced bodies, the Equisapiens easily defeat the guards and rip open the van door to rescue him. When a company helicopter appears overhead with a searchlight, the Equisapiens are forced to flee. Even so, the protesters consider it a victory, and Detroit is so impressed by Cassius's plan that she gets back together with him. Afterward, he moves back into his uncle's garage, though he keeps the expensive furniture stored inside his car. With his last bit of money, he buys Salvador a nice car as an apology for betraying him. When Detroit comes to visit him, their romantic moment is interrupted by unbearable pain. Cassius looks up and realizes he's transforming into an Equisapien after all. Sometime later, Steve hears the doorbell ring. When he checks the security cameras, he's horrified to discover Cassius leading the Equisapiens to invade his mansion, bringing Sorry to Bother You, the 2018 science fiction drama film, to an end. That was full movie recaps. See you in the next video.